So Rick and Pete, this is great to have the three of us all together, on this podcast today. I know it was a bit of a challenge coordinating three different time zones, but I'm glad it worked out.
Well,
And
you're coordinating the fact that I'm terrible at emails, that I look at emails very rarely, and I don't even know what my philosophy of email looking is, but sometimes I look straight away, and sometimes it's 2 weeks later. So my apologies.
oh, no, 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 but that's okay. I'll get to psychoanalyze you maybe later around
Yes,
that issue.
thank you. Thank you.
No, and y'all are probably recognizing I'm kind of an obsessive and probably check emails way too much. So hopefully it didn't create too much friction or stress.
Oh yeah, well at least my calendar is always very free. I have to say I practice. Richard and I were talking about a thinker recently, a guy called, I think it's Byung Chul Han, might be mispronouncing him, but he talks about the what's the word, the good side of laziness, the virtue of laziness, and I'm very good at that. So I do keep my schedule as free as I can.
I love that. We need more of that. When you mentioned that book in the episode that we did on the podcast a couple weeks ago, I actually found a free PDF version of it and started reading it. It's a great work
Yeah,
on
yeah,
the
really.
Burnout Society.
Yes, really interesting book. He's become very, his name's been floating around for a while. A lot of people are into him, and maybe that was one of the reasons why I didn't read him for a while. But
Got you.
then I read it, and I was like, he gives such a brilliant analysis of this society, as you know, of the achievement society, of this society in which it's all about optimization, life hacking, seizing the day, being your own boss, and all of this. And actually, that
Sure.
creates its own symptomatic, pathological results. And so, yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, no, that's great. So where I kind of want the conversation to go is for us building off of Rick's two books that we've both explored together, Blown Away, which he reflects on, his son's suicide and how he was blown away through that experience, and then his newest book, Embracing the Void, Rethinking the Origin of the Sacred, kind of a Lacanian approach to the sacred. I was hoping we could just explore what we mean by almost a posture of unknowing, wherever that leads us, and then what that might mean for a radical Christianity or radical Christianities in the plural.
Mhm.
So I know that's kind of a big kind of topic, but I just kind of I want to see where we go with that.
Yeah. I mean, can I, or Richard, do you want to go first?
Well, I was just going to say that I was really blindsided by this development in my life. Not only now it's 17 years ago that my son really in a terrible despair over a drug addiction that he just could not seem to get under control. He killed himself. And that left me, of course, as I think suicide almost always does, with this my own life or death question about what happened. How did we come to this? I mean, the question of the urgency to somehow cling to some kind of understanding where I had at the moment none, or next to none, was really driving me. And I started writing this, what now is this memoir that finally appeared 16 years after I began it. I began writing just to try and explain to myself what had happened. In any event, what was interesting is that this desire to come to know and understand, while it did bear a lot of fruit, I mean, I certainly learned a lot from the multiple editions, that are versions of this book that I wrote. It ended up leaving me most poignantly with this feeling, a sense of the inescapability of our unknowing, that we simply cannot fill in the blanks. And of course, it's all the more both interesting but also somewhat traumatizing that these voids of knowing, these zones in which we simply can't get our bearings, are concerning the most elemental and important things in our life. So it's kind of like these black spots, these kind of blanks, aren't just kind of occasional sideline concerns. They're really the centerpiece, the central, heartbeat of our existence.
Mm.
And the more I began to think about all of this, the more I slowly, over this, literally over 15 years, began to open a whole new horizon for me. And in that, of course, there's a really profound paradox: coming to grips with the limits of what you know, and with some kind of really wrenching, definite sense of unknowing, as if unknowing is a kind of spiritual task, led me to rethink the whole problematic of religious belief. And it was that path that led me to finally, after spending 35 years or more thinking about psychoanalytic theory, and in particular in its Lacanian version, I began to think, wow, what if there is a whole theory of religious life and the religious posture that's centered on this question of unknowing? And then, to my surprise, I realized, almost like the idiot who finally is struck by what one always was thinking about, that is to say, this notion of das Ding, the unknown thing in the other. It all kind of came together for me that the real key to a Lacanian perspective on the religious is centered on this whole problematic of unknowing. And thereby, these two books in the last 15 years of my life were kind of one effort, one kind of, and one insight in a certain sense.
Yeah. Wow. That's so well said. Yeah, Pete, please.
There's a friend of mine, someone Richard knows as well, who's just tragically lost a child in the same way. And one of the things that he's struggling with, and I saw this in the book Blown Away, is the question of why, and the desire, and the agonizing, excruciatingly painful question of why did this person do this? And it feels like the desire to overcome that unknowing, and then gradually somehow coming to peace with not being able to answer that question. I don't know if, Richard, you got anything to say about that dimension? Because I just noticed with my friend, that is one of the overarching dimensions of the suffering, is that radical, almost looking for the reason, and trying to, like a detective, find any evidence, asking friends or family members to kind of try to penetrate this unknowability of this act.
Of course, I think early on, I think it's really crucial to acknowledge that what I'm trying to convey in these two books, and I already know I need to write some more, even just to fill out the explanation of this train of thought to myself. What we're dealing with is definitely not a kind of celebration of ignorance, as if, or kind of a sort of an undermining of the value of our efforts to try to know. On the contrary, I'm more, I mean, in a way, the book on religion from a Lacanian point of view, Embracing the Void, it's a very sustained argument in which I try to really lay out as clearly as I can what I take to be the lesson that Lacan himself didn't explicitly draw out and develop. He kind of hinted at it constantly through his teaching, coming back over and over and over again to religious ideas, religious figures, religious texts and traditions, but never giving it a kind of comprehensive presentation. I found a new way in which there was a lot to say about what one could know and one could understand in ways that were really illuminating and really expanding, mind expanding. Nevertheless, so the first thing to say is we're not, or I'm certainly not trying to sort of celebrate a kind of a happy idiocy where one says, oh, well, we just don't know, and there it goes. We'll have to just let go of that. On the contrary, what I'm after and what I experienced and what I'm really now excited to think more about is how the most important things in our lives are rooted in things that we don't understand, and that we don't, I think, recognize that in the right way. And what fascinates me about what I'm kind of left with, and as maybe a project that is going to take me the rest of my life to sort through a little more and a little better, is what does this say about the human condition, that we do have to struggle, of course, to know everything we can, especially about the people that we love. But there's some residue of unknowing the things about the others, some including the ones to whom we're the closest and with whom we have the most intimate and deeply knowing relationships. We rightly say we know them deeply, but we also fail to know them. And this dimension of what we don't quite grasp about our parents, about our grandparents, about our siblings, and of course, our children and our lovers, this dimension of what we don't ever fully know is always present, but we don't always face up to it and then embrace it. And one of the things that I was left with, which I've been trying to explain to myself ever since, is precisely how love is bound up with unknowing. That many times the things that we most treasure about people we love are the limits of what we can say that we know, the limits of what we can predict, the ways they surprise us, or the way that their most powerful motives and passions arise from places in their souls that we don't grasp.
Have we lost Richard? Where's my connection gone down?
I think it might have been yours. There you are.
Anyway, I feel like it's really important to lay that out a bit at the start.
I think that's so great. Pete, go ahead. I think you gestured that you wanted to say something.
Well, I thought I cut out. I think I did cut out for a second,
Oh,
but
okay.
only for a couple of seconds. But
Gotcha.
oh yeah, we'll say something now. You've invited me in. But as Richard's talking about that unknowing, and the kind of key twist there is, of course, it's not that the other has this essential oasis that we can get to, that they know themselves, like an authentic, substantive self that we can never penetrate and we can never know. But there's this radical sense in which the other doesn't know themselves. That love, as Richard's talking about, is a type of attaching to that dimension, which is connected to desire. We desire the ones we desire the desire of the ones we desire. The most precious material in the world isn't gold or health or anything like that. It's the desire of those we desire. And desire, it comes about because of lack. You desire, in a sense, what is somehow missing. So love is this interesting connection where two people's desires, two people's lacks kind of intertwine in an interesting and powerful way.
Oh, yeah.
That is a crucial point, the way in which the unknown in the other, what I cannot fully see, the non-transparency of the other, reflects my non-transparency to myself. That my own, and this is the great teaching of Freud, but the one that Lacan then really re-elaborates in really suggestive ways, that my relationship to my own life and my own being is shot through with this limitation that I don't know myself, and that I only come to relate to myself more effectively, more deeply through the other and the realization of what I don't know in them. the detour, you might say, just to discover what is essential in myself. I pass through the detour of my experience of the other. And one of the great, most obvious and most important and also rather simple points here is that when we first meet somebody who really intrigues us, in which the spark of love is really suddenly struck, it's often with the feeling that we both have some sense of recognition of this person, that they somehow trigger something that we remember or something that we dream about. There's something that we've always kind of longed for. And yet we don't know them. And we're intrigued precisely by the dimension of what escapes us.
Yeah.
And
it's almost,
go ahead.
Say, there's not knowing something because you don't know, you can want to go out with somebody because you're lonely, you don't know the person, you're just kind of, so there's somebody maybe out there you're going to meet, but you don't know them. Then there's, you get to know them. And then there's the knowing that you don't know them, which comes from that deep connection. And it's that move from like classical physics, where there's a type of unknowing, maybe why the universe has these fundamental laws, but within those fundamental laws, we can know everything, right? The kind of like, technically, if you know everything about the speed and the placement of every atom, you can tell the future, you can tell the past. Everything is hypothetically knowable, with the exception, as I say, of some sort of fundamental principles. But in modern physics, you get the idea that no, there's an unknowing within the structure itself. There's an unknowing in terms of like a fuzziness within reality. My favorite joke of the comedian Mitch Hegbig, I always forget his surname, but he's got this brilliant joke. He always seems like he's stoned, and he's talking like Bigfoot, and he says, Bigfoot, all the pictures of Bigfoot are fuzzy. And he said, one day I just had this insight. He says, maybe Bigfoot's fuzzy, right? And I kind of think of that in terms of physics, is going like, we've always looked at the universe and gone, it looks fuzzy. And then in terms of kind of Niels Bohr or something, the kind of insight, well, maybe the universe is fuzzy. And so there's a kind of spontaneity within reality itself. That's kind of the knowing unknowing, which doesn't come from an ignorance. It actually comes from a deep reflection, contemplation, and understanding.
Yeah. So guys, I kind of wanted to see, so building on everything the two of you have been saying and really picking up on what you were talking about, Rick, in terms of love, when I was kind of fantasizing about what we would talk about and what this episode would really kind of get into, I know I mentioned an idea of like a radical Christianity, and I don't know what that means. I'm just wanting to explore it. I thought, could we take St. Paul's 3 kind of big theological virtues that he kind of articulates, faith, hope, and love, and maybe put them through the lens or the framework, Rick, that you've been writing about? How could a kind of unknowing Lacanian Christianity think about those 3 virtues, faith, hope, and love? How would they be different? How in what ways would you want to talk about them? And Pete, please chime in too, because I know your work, I think, centers around some of that.
Yeah. In fact, in one way, I think Richard's work really looks at Jesus, and I've got this real interest in Christ. So it'd be interesting to hear the 2 approaches on that. So, Richard's just written the book, so I'll let him start.
Okay.
And what I want to do is I want to give a Christology and see what you and Richard think of it. So that's my desire, is to kind of give a reading of a type of institutional Christian Lacanian approach, and see if you think there's any water in it.
Okay, awesome.
Richard, you go first.
Well, I take in the book, in Embracing the Void, I more and more found myself kind of forced to take as my primary sort of claim that Christianity is very, very deeply divided between an enormous breakthrough that Jesus, this kind of wandering rabbi, gives to his followers, and then the Pauline turn after the death of Jesus, actually some decades after the death of Jesus. The first writings about Jesus, I argue, on this Lacanian basis, ironically enough, betray the essential vision of Jesus, which I want to argue is absolutely centered on the way love is a posture in the unknown.
Mm.
That love and charity, that the whole admonition to embrace the neighbor and even to embrace with love the enemy faces the would-be follower of Jesus with an embrace of something one does not know. You don't fully know, particularly, of course, with the enemy. And this is the one that Jesus really emphasizes. He says, well, you find in the Torah the injunction to love the neighbor, love the person who's right across the street from you. Even that person you don't know, you don't really have an exhaustive sense of who they are. You're being asked to embrace something that you don't have a full handle on. But particularly when Jesus says, I add something else, I add the demand that you embrace, that you love, that you extend yourself to the enemy. Here you're really off the comfortable plane of what you can claim to know about. You're in a sort of zone of the unknown. And that struck me as this sort of linkage between love and unknowing, that love keeps open this space of what we don't know fully how to name and how to conceptualize. And one of the proofs of this, I think, is that the surest way to tell a love relation that's in trouble is when they go to the counselor and the first thing out of one of their mouths, is met by the other, but with a sort of claim of being sick of hearing the same thing. You always say the same thing. You're so predictable. I know just what you're going to say before you even say it.
Mm.
Here's a relationship in trouble. And what you really, I think, is essential to grasp here is the relationship, the couple who's really in trouble, actually have the illusion of knowing each other too well, knowing each other to the point of being totally sick of each other.
Mm.
The dimension of the unknown has been sort of remaindered.
Yeah. Now, Rick, don't you think when you're in your book and your thoughts, whenever you describe love for the other, even love of the enemy, that it can and will produce quite a bit of anxiety as well, and that had an impact on Christianity and how it developed into this doctrinal tradition?
Yes, I think exactly right. Doctrinal, yes, absolutely. I make the argument that Christianity really invents faith and belief in particular as the kind of standard for the religious posture. And I basically make this argument that it boiled down to its real essentials, that belief is a kind of a mode of coping with the dimension of unknowing, filling in the blank, as it were. And it's in the simplest level, it's quite effective, all too effective in arranging other people in the world, either on the side of shared belief, the one that I also sustain and subscribe to, which makes them a known quantity, or relegating them to the apostates on the other side of the ledger somewhere who don't have my beliefs, don't share my faith, and therefore I can sort of dismiss these people in one way or another. So what I take to be the essential teaching of Jesus, this embrace of the other with the openness of love, not only when you don't know them, but even when you have already taken the distance of regarding them as your enemy. It takes all of that and brings it back to this center of not knowing, and that is exactly what needs to be embraced.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Pete?
Yeah, and by the way, for some reason, every now and again I do a thumbs up on the video for anyone who's watching. That is not me. Now, I would put a thumbs up for Richard for his entire everything he's saying, but if every now and again a thumbs up appears, my computer is doing that. I don't know how to do that. the interesting thing is, so yeah, this is actually one of the differences maybe with me and Richard, is because I've always considered myself a bit of a Paulinian. And I kind of want to kind of give a reading of that approach as well, and then see how this fits.
Please.
Yeah, because in some respects, I've always had the impression, although less so from Richard's work, but I always had the impression that if the main interesting thing about Jesus were the Gospels and this idea of loving, even loving one's enemy, it wouldn't have necessarily become a religion. It wouldn't have generated something the way it is. But it's really Paul who kind of makes Christianity into a religion of sorts. And I think there's something that happens there that's really interesting. So I'll give you if you don't mind, a kind of a reading of how God is understood, maybe within traditional confessional Christianity first. Often within mysticism, there's the idea that there's the appearance, the way the world is, and then there is the absolute God. And the appearance can never match up to the essence. So our words always fail, our experiences always fail in some way to grasp God or the absolute ultimate reality. And there's kind of two maybe basic mystical approaches to that. One is that occasionally we can have these liminal experiences in which we, maybe through an experience, some sort of encounter, we briefly, feel at one with the absolute. So briefly, all of the limitations of finitude and temporality seem to go away, and we're taken up into the absolute. Or a more Kantian notion might be that we never get that, but through the failure, we kind of indirectly sense that there is something there. There's, our words and our experience never touch on the absolute, but there's an interesting way in which language can know its own failure. Language can know its own limits, and so there's a kind of unknowing there. There's like the essence, the absolute that we cannot know. As I say, we may have a moment where we are lost in it, but then we don't really know it. It's more like your ego, your sense of self completely dissolves away, and maybe you feel a oneness with everything or something like that. Or, as I say, that more Kantian notion that the reality is always filtered through our senses and these categories of understanding. So we never experience what is in itself, but only what appears to be. One of the interesting things about Lacan is around this notion that Boothby writes so brilliantly about, called the objet petit a, the object A, called object A. And an example of how object A operates is, I'm a speaker and I used to do a lot of public speaking before COVID. Don't do it anymore really, but people would often say to me, because I would speak very fast when I get animated, I speak, and then I would gesture lots and I would go off on loads of tangents, right? And I'd pace. And people would say, you'd be a good speaker if you calmed down, slowed down, didn't go crazy with hand gestures, walk around, didn't always go in needless kind of directions. But of course, the answer to that is no. Then if I did all those things, I'd be a bad speaker. At the moment, I'm a bad speaker, but I also generate the fantasy that I could be an incredible speaker if I did those things, right? So the very failure to do them generated the fantasy of this brilliant speaker. And in a way, that's kind of how object A works. It's kind of almost a failure that potentially generates the very thing that it seems to be an obstacle to. So, for example, you say, words cannot describe how much I love you. But really, the failure to describe is what kind of describes. The failure is a success. The best way to say you love someone is to say, I can't describe it, But maybe even a better example is, often people don't sacrifice because they love, but we often love because we sacrifice. Maybe a mother, 9 months before the kid arrives, there's so much sacrifice. I mean, you've sacrificed everything, and even in preparation, there's so much sacrifice. And to some extent, all of that sacrifice, how could it not do anything but generate a profound experience of love? As sometimes people would say, someone isn't jealous because they love, they love because they're jealous. In other words, by being jealous, they're able to generate a desire, right? Now, the reason why I'm saying all of this is I think what's interesting in Christianity is this idea that Christ, this temporal, finite figure, is the manifestation of the atemporal, eternal God, right? So there's this kind of notion. And one way of thinking about this from a Lacanian perspective is that so Christ, Jesus Christ, is the obstacle to God, right? At the time he's within this established religion, he's seen as that which is the obstacle to God and needs to be crucified, gotten rid of. And then the Christological insight that comes afterwards is the idea that the obstacle to God is precisely what generates God. Like precisely in the finite, temporal, fragile body of this just regular person is entirely generated the eternal, everlasting essence. And so Christ is the kind of object A. And if you take this reading, it's different. So for me, this is what radical theology is. It's different from mystical theology. There's a lot of connections, but there's also a slight difference, which is not that our language fails to describe some essential reality, but the failure itself generates an essential reality that does not exist but insists. And whenever John Caputo, the theologian, talks about the insistence of God as a better term than the existence of God, you go, to be human is to experience an insistency of perfection, an insistency of something wonderful and beautiful, the kingdom of God, whatever. There's this insistence of that message that haunts us. But to be Christian, in a sense, is to emulate Christ, i.e., to realize that the obstacle to the kingdom of God is the kingdom of God. And the struggle to enact the kingdom of God is the enacting of the kingdom of God. The enjoyment of failure, of never actually getting to the essence. But in one sense, always operating within that failure is kind of what it means to be Christian. So that's kind of in a nutshell, kind of the moment I became a Lacanian was when I kind of realized that Lacanian ideas could really help to shed new light on these old theological issues.
See, Rick, I want you to say something, but see if this speaks at all. I feel like where you get into that in your book is just around almost the impossibility of loving the neighbor and loving the enemy, even though that's the call, that's the task. There is an impossibility there that maybe sets it all in motion again. I don't know if that's exactly what you guys are saying, but that's how I kind of understand it. Is we're being called to love our enemy, but I don't think that we really ultimately can. But that's a part of the project.
I would try. I'm going to try to say something brief here. Not my forte, as you know. I go on too long. But what Peter was just laying out, I share a great deal of that. That the idea that the impasse is precise and the impossible obstacle turns out to be precisely the opening, and that love as the essential Jesus message is such an opening in the face of an obstacle. And the obstacle, of course, is intimately bound up, if not absolutely centered, on the problem of knowing. You're asked by Jesus' injunction to love the neighbor, and even more so to love the enemy, to embrace what you are afraid of. You're being asked to make space in your life for what you do not understand, you don't have a grasp, but to remain open to it, and lovingly, acceptingly, humbly open to it as if it really is the key to knowing yourself. There we get this marvelous Lacanian dimension that it's only through the encounter with the other, in their very otherness, that I'm reopened to myself, to what I don't know about myself, to what's potential in me, but as yet been unrealized and even unrecognized. The problem of Paul is bound up for me in this, in a way that many Christians may really object to, because there's no question that the mainstream of Christianity made in Paul's kind of line of interpretation of the life of Jesus and its significance, or more importantly, the death of Jesus.
Yes, the death, yes, because he's not very interested in the life of Jesus
Right.
at all. He doesn't talk
Yeah.
about the miracles or the teachings or the sayings, which I quite like. But anyway, I want to hear what Richard says.
Well, and I when you talk about it, I want to say to myself, yeah, and I agree. But then I also really object to the Pauline interpretation, and precisely because, to put it in its crudest terms, these are the terms in which Nietzsche is most critical of Paul's contribution. These days, Paul gets a kind of, from a lot of very important thinkers, Badiou and other people, it gets a really sympathetic rereading. I don't want to totally throw that rereading out, but it does seem to me that Nietzsche's fundamental point has to be taken really seriously, that Paul arrives and says, well, the real problem is the afterlife and getting your ticket into the afterlife of being saved and the heavenly bliss that will be your reward. When it seems to me we have to really insist that the teaching of Jesus is not about the next life. It's about this one. It's about embracing with love and acceptance what is right in front of you now. It's something between you and your fellow human being. The transcendence, the kingdom that Jesus refers to, it's right here, right now. It's not in some next life. So we have to be, in my view, to retrieve the teaching, the real upshot of the teaching of Jesus is to really resist this kind of return or turn to the afterlife where all questions will be answered, and to recommit ourselves in love to the moment we're living in right now, where the questions are not answered. Precisely that.
So yeah, so jumping into that, so a couple of things. Yeah, one is, and we've talked about this before, is that like I do like the idea of life after death, but I interpret that, and I believe it's true. There's life after death, and psychoanalysis gives the evidence for that, and the evidence for that is castration. That life only exists because of death. Like there's a fundamental loss, fundamental death one has to pass through in order to be alive. So in a way, all of us are marked from this, what's called the incest taboo in anthropology or castration of psychoanalysis. Our subjectivity is precisely this kind of, birth through death. And the reason why I'm interested in Paul is because here's my genealogy in a nutshell, is that, there's Jesus walking around, lives and dies. Then Paul, his insight, and maybe the only thing I like about Paul potentially, is his insight that the death of God, that this is interpreted as the death of God, and the death of God has some sort of significance. So he says that he kind of like has some idea that this is central to, is a salvatory act, the death of God, but it's just done in a very kind of cultic Christian way. Then Luther comes along and he raises it to the level of a theological principle. Then Hegel raises it to the level of a philosophical principle. Then Nietzsche brings it into an existential event that one must pass through. One must pass through the death of God. Then Freud creates, then basically there's a regression. Then, the existentialists talk about trying to live into the death of God. Then Freud offers us the technology of how to actually bring this death of God into our being, and Lacan kind of like clarifies it. So I put Paul right at the beginning of that and go like, if we didn't have this concept of the death of God as a significant, pregnant notion, I maybe could have still gotten there, but it's kind of, that's where I see it beginning with Paul. Like otherwise we've got a really good guy walking around and being nice and being loving, but with Paul we have this notion that the absolute is alive and dead in this in this regular individual.
Mm.
But what do you think, Richard? Like, do you think, like, as part of that genealogy, do we need Paul?
Once again, I kind of am very, very close to what you're saying, and in many ways want to agree with it, but I want to resist the appeal that most people, it seems to me, cling to about an afterlife in the most kind of simple and obvious form. The thing that starts with our physical death here. The paradox that somehow
Jesus was into that as well.
Sorry?
Jesus was into that as well, was he not? That he believed in an afterlife.
Well, it's hard to say, because our picture of Jesus was so much, not exclusively, of course, but was so much painted by Paul. So we have our knowledge of Jesus already kind of pre-filtered through Paul's perspective, which makes of Jesus this sort of moment of salvation, the sort of good news that this life is not the real game, that the real fulfillment is in the next life. And I to put it in really concrete terms, I'm going to a funeral on next Wednesday morning. Someone who I know who lost her father. And this person is a very devout Catholic, family. And this woman, who's a little younger than I am, she may be 60, has lost her father, and I think is really deeply consoled by the idea that her father now is at rest, as we say, that her father has surely crossed into the zone of the afterlife where he is really enfolded in the love of God and Jesus. And she's kind of looking, I feel fairly confident of being able to say, she's looking at the funeral as a kind of celebration of his life, but also a kind of a heaving a huge sigh of relief, fueled by her own love for her father, that now he's okay, now he's at rest, now he's beyond this life, and in peace and tranquility and belonging, et cetera, et cetera. My sense is that there's an enormous danger, spiritual danger, in this way of regarding death and salvation. And I would have to say that it's the flip side of my own experiences of death. And my death of my son was the most traumatic and the most horrifying. But what it did to me was it made me realize that as I was struggling with trying to understand his suicide, trying to come to some shred of knowledge that would give me a kind of a stabilization in what felt like a free fall, in what felt like it felt like I myself had become a kind of ghost, that I had become kind of dead. It was like the bullet that killed my son was killing me, or maybe I was already killed by it. And the struggle was to get back. The paradoxical thing was that the demand that I had kind of given to myself to try to understand finally gave way to a kind of realization: I can't understand it. There is no knowledge here that is going to satisfy me. And then the second crucial moment was, it's not just that I don't understand exactly why he died, why he made that decision to pull the trigger at the last moment. I'll never know that. What was really liberating was realizing that the person I loved so much, he was 23 years old when he died, I had been extraordinarily close to him, and he to me. And I realized in his death, I realized, not only do I not understand the suicide and the tragedy of his end, I didn't understand many things about him when he was alive. And many of the things that I most treasured about him, his fascination with clouds, his fascination with little round odd stones or pieces
Mm.
of driftwood that he would collect. He these little objects animated him in a way that was really lovely to see and contagious. I still collect little stones myself, uh, uh, kind of in his spirit, as it were.
Mm.
The interesting thing, and for me, the liberating thing, it wasn't without its own pain, but the really life rejuvenating thing was realizing that he was bigger than anything I really could put in a nutshell about knowing him. He was a wonderful mystery. And the things that I loved the most about him, I couldn't really explain, even to myself. And it suddenly occurred to me that maybe the real gift of death is when the person is taken from us physically, they can reappear to us, if we're open to it, in what we did and did not know about them. My father died maybe 8 years ago. So he outlived my son by about 6 or 7 years. And I've been astonished at how in the last 8 years, my father has come back to me. Mostly, interestingly enough, realizing how whatever I did know of him, and there's a heck of a lot I did, of course, there was a lot that was mysterious, and now it announces itself more enigmatically than ever. Why he was driven by the things that he loved, what he wanted for us, his children and his family, what he quietly and secretly sacrificed, who he really was at the core.
Mm.
In one sense, I, of course, knew him better than anyone. But in another sense, I realized since he died, I was in a kind of relation of unknowing of the most intimate things about who he really was. And I found it liberating and quite transformative, to dwell with that and kind of savor it in a funny way, in these years since his death, as if the real funeral
Mm.
is an ongoing relationship in which one is open to the real person, very much including not only what we did know about them, but what we didn't.
Yeah.
And isn't that excess? I'm sorry, Pete. Isn't
And
that excess or mystery in the person the sacred?
That's precisely my sense of it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Real quick, I don't know if you guys have ever read the book by Cormac McCarthy, The Road. It's this post-apocalyptic story, a father and a son going through the country. But at one point, the father I think he looks at the son and says, if you're not the son of God, then there is no son of God, which I think is a way of saying, yeah, the sacred is found in the excess or the mystery that is the human person, the other in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so like I that all of that is beautiful, and I want to put that in the frame of saying almost that if we are marked by death, through coming into life, so really we're marked by a lack, a loss, a sense of having lost a primordial unity with, say, the mother other. Like we have a sense in which there was an oceanic oneness that we lost. Then, but if there's a kind of we're marked by this throughout our lives, then for me, the death of God is where we acknowledge that lack and that loss is woven into everything, in all reality itself. So for me, my reading of Christianity is it's, yeah, it's not, it's not to get into some sort of eternal life, but it's somehow that we're already dead in some way. To be alive is to have lack woven within us. So, there's that beautiful Islamic parable of a guy who tries to escape death. He goes down to the marketplace and there's death walking through the market and their eyes meet. the guy freaks out because Death looks at him with his knowing stare, and the guy's like, Death is after me, runs back to his master and says, I was down getting provisions for this party of yours, and I saw Death, and he looked at me, and I know he's after me. And you know the parable probably, but the master says, jump on a horse, ride as fast as you can. You can get to the neighboring city of Samar by midnight, but only if you don't stop. Do not stop for anything. And then the guy goes down into the marketplace once his servant is taken off, finds Death having a cappuccino, goes up to him and says, what are you doing scaring my servant? Death looks at him surprised and goes, oh, I wasn't trying to scare him. I was just surprised. I said, he's walking through the market buying stuff. He says, he's going to have to get his skates on. I have a meeting with him in Samara at midnight, right? So, of course, the idea can never escape death. Even more radically than that, is the existential insight that guilt is a form of death. You're not who you want to be, and meaninglessness is a type of death where you feel a lack of meaning. Like death isn't just waiting in Samara for us. Death is also within us, and like as in lack, it kind of constitutes us. But something we kind of deny and deny and deny. And then in this notion of the death of God, there is, as I say, then this confrontation with and tarrying with that negativity, that lack. And as I say, that acknowledgement that lack is not just in me, it's also in you, and it's also in every alternative world. Because we always have alternative worlds. Sometimes, I didn't go out with that woman I wanted to go out with, or that man I wanted to go out with. Oh, but there's an alternative world where we did go out with them, and we're caught up in that alternative world. We're imagining, everything would have been great if.
Right.
So we have these alternative universes where we're happy, and go like, no, you'd have been just as unhappy in that alternative universe. Now, maybe a little bit happier or a little bit unhappier, but you would never have gotten rid of the lack. Like, I understand, like, Paul has a notion of life after death, et cetera, et cetera. But the interesting thing about any of these thinkers for me is not what they shared in common with all the other people of their time. Like even with Jesus, love your neighbor, as Richard talks about in his book, was not novel or unique. So that's not the interesting thing. You always concentrate on what was the thing that they said that was radical, which for Jesus, love your enemy. So for me, Paul says lots of things that, are just kind of what a lot of people thought at the time. So what's the unique thing? And for me, it was this insight that somehow that which cannot die, that which is eternal, and is outside of death and finitude, somehow undergoes death, and also in that death is somehow unified with this finite, so that Christ becomes the unity of unity and difference. And more interestingly, Christ, then the infinite, is birthed in the finite. The eternal is birthed out, which is a really, really interesting, I think, theological idea that the confessional church has not, I don't think, harnessed. I don't think I think the confessional church is a denial of the radicality of that idea.
Okay. So building on that, this is a question for both of you, but I just had this insight, Rick. The title of your book is Embracing the Void. I feel like confessional Christianity says fill the void,
yes,
complete or somehow satisfy the void. But you're talking about tarrying with a lack.
Yes. Can I mention it theologically? Yep. Like if you think of lack as in a debt, a monetary debt, so you owe money, that is a nothing, it is something, right? You have a debt and you're tied into paying that debt back. And often you'll get letters and phone calls telling you to give that money back. So if you think of like the letters and the phone calls, like kind of a superegoic injunction to pay your debts, right? In some confessional Christianity, there's an idea that Christ pays your debt. To pay a debt is to fill a lack. You owe £100, someone else pays it. But actually, I think the theological radicality is in the forgiveness of debt. To forgive a debt is not to pay it. To forgive a debt is to say that the nothingness that is something is nothing, is to render the sting of the nothingness, to take away the sting of nothingness, not to get rid of it, but to kind of rob it of its sting. And I think, the year of Jubilee was never about paying debts, it was about forgiving debts. So I do think that there's this notion of filling the lack. but actually a radical reading, I think, is of actually not trying to fill the lack, but somehow just taking away the letters and the phone calls, kind of a bankruptcy, basically a theological bankruptcy where you don't have to pay the debt anymore.
Right.
And very quickly, I'll give you like my reading of Christianity in a nutshell is it starts off with an Oedipal story. Like, Adam and Eve want an apple. There's a prohibition, you can't have it. And the prohibition generates the excessive desire, objet A, right? Well, what makes the object magical is precisely you can't have it. Just like a kid's toy, you can't play with that toy; it becomes magical. Is the moment you take away his possibility. So I know you've got, Oedipus, who wants to sleep with his mother, doesn't know it's his mother, but whatever, the father's in the way. The whole thing about that story is it's a great response to fulfill your dreams, right? So you see these things on Instagram, fulfill your dreams. Well, Freud would say, yes, fulfill your dreams so that you can understand the abject horror of your dreams, right? Only when you fulfill your dreams do you realize your dreams do not fulfill you, right? So Oedipus breaks through the prohibition, sleeps with his mother, and it's a disaster. In the story of Adam and Eve, they break through the prohibition. They eat the apple. They have this super egoic voice, the serpent, saying, eat the apple, you will be like God, which means you will lack the lack, you will be whole and complete, right? So they eat the apple, it's a disaster. In the temple of Jerusalem in the New Testament, you kind of, for me, have a replaying of Adam and Eve. You've got the temple, you've got the Holy of Holies, you've got a big curtain, and then you've got the court of Gentiles where you do all of your kind of buying and selling. And the moment that Christ cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? I.e., that the absolute has lack within itself. At that very moment, the narrative is the curtain rips. And the curtain rips, and suddenly you see in the Holy of Holies, and it's empty. There's nothing there, right? It's an empty room, right? The curtain generated the belief that the sacred was on the other side of it. However, it doesn't end there. Then you realize the sacred as an object doesn't exist. But then you have the idea that the sacred is not an object that you love. The sacred is a dimension you encounter in the act of love itself. So there's a slight change in the sacred dimension. And that for me is kind of like the salvatory act of Christianity, moving you from the idea of the sacred as an object that you love to the sacred as a depth dimension in the act of love itself.
That's fucking powerful. What do you think, Rick? I mean, is there anything that's coming up for you?
Well, I think that I agree with almost everything that Peter is saying about the opening toward lack, the opening toward unknowing is the key. And one way to look at this, it seems to me, is that that our ordinary posture toward our existence assumes we know our way about, as Wittgenstein says. Philosophy is the moment when we realize we don't know our way about as clearly as we thought we did. But and of course, when we turn relationships and people and objects into monetary values, we think about everything in terms of a payment or a debt or a value in money. I devote a couple of sections to the whole question of money, and toward the end of the book. Money makes us, count things, makes us evaluate things in concrete terms, as if we can barter and meet the exchange and be quit of each other. It seems to me money is like knowing in general. It makes us confident that we know the stakes. We know what's owed. We know what we need to give in order to be free of the debt. But it strikes me that what's really being called for, and maybe this is why Jesus was so distrustful of the money changers in the temple, why he found money to be so dangerous, is that money gives us the illusion of knowing. In fact, you could now argue, and this is a place where I follow Heidegger, that knowing and Freud, that we fool ourselves into an illusion that we understand in everyday life. We know our way about in the world all too well. And what really strikes me as the message that is really disturbing, but ultimately wonderfully liberating and revealing moment of the Christ message is, don't stick with what you know, what you think you know, but open yourself precisely to what you don't know. One way to think of it is that is opening itself, to be open to the other, to be open to life, to be open to beauty, to be open to love, means suspending what you think you know in order to be available for a new lesson, a new horizon, something you've never thought before. That's what is really the opening of, I think, what Jesus calls the kingdom.
Is that connected to hope?
Is between us, Sorry?
I'm wondering, is what you just said connected to hope? Or
well, I think it, yeah, that takes us back to the question we had about Paul a minute ago, though.
Yeah.
What do we mean by hope?
Yeah.
How much do we fill in the blank of hope? If only I could get A, B, or C, that would be the fulfillment of my hope. What if hope is not a longing for a particular thing that'll satisfy me, but rather, what if hope is precisely the posture, the existential posture toward the opening of what we don't know what to expect? Hope is a real opening. One way to understand this, I think, is to say, ask, what is respect? When I respect another person, what am I really doing? Aren't we holding open our judgment? We're saying, not only I respect this person because of what they have done and what I do know about them, but I respect a person. I have respect for the other when I leave open my judgment and say, well, respecting them means being ready to be surprised, to be proved wrong in what I've always thought about them. I leave a kind of opening of a kind of forgiveness, if you will, toward the other, open to what is perhaps not yet experienced by me, but what is, if I'm alert to it and open to it, what is lovable in them.
There's René Girard has an interesting parable where he says a man is told that there's a treasure in a rocky field. And so he goes into the rocky field and he starts to pick up rocks to look for the treasure. And he has no success. And eventually the man finds a rock so heavy he can't lift it. And so I think a really beautiful parable that sometimes, and this is the negative, I want to kind of like look at the negative side of unknowing, which Richard talked about earlier, is that sometimes we so want there to be some essential, something that will fulfill us, make us whatever. And the more we can't find it, eventually we start self-sabotaging to keep alive the dream, right? If the man kept on turning over rocks, he'd have to come to terms with something very, very traumatic, which is there is no treasure. So by self-sabotaging, he keeps the dream alive. I know someone who wanted to write a children's book, and she wanted to write this book for many, many years, but she never did. And it was a very short story. And it was obvious that she did have the time to read it and she knew it, but there was something in her that enjoyed the obstacle itself. There was something she was getting out of not writing the story. And in many ways, I think it might have been about, different parts of her life, that were difficult. So the interesting thing about that is, right, there's a kind of unknowing, and there's a kind of movement towards something. We've been talking about how the obstacle is important. Like, we actually enjoy the obstacle, right? It's the obstacle that creates the enjoyment and whatever. But we often don't see that it's the obstacle that is the place of enjoyment. Now, the reason why I'm saying all of this is, for me, the really radical understanding of unknowing is that the obstacle that means we can never get, so say language, of my language, my experience, or what it is that means that the unknown always remains unknown, that experience is one thing. But when you start to think that, it's actually the failure to understand the unknown that generates the unknown and the unknowability as well, right? It's all generated by the failure. And that's where life is. Life is in realizing that the unknowing, as I say, I kind of always keep coming back to the unknowing is not that we don't know substantial thing, or there's some substantive reality that we grasp, we'll get it. But it's like the idea that, oh, God is, so I'll give you one parable I think captures the very essence of Christianity. Forgive me if you've heard it before, but this very religious guy called Seamus, who loses everything, right? Loses his job, afraid if he can't pay his rent. And he hears a voice from God. He prays, hears a voice from God. And God says, listen, Seamus, he says, get everything you have, sell everything, take that money and go to Vegas. And so Seamus is like, he's not sure. He says, seriously, God? Like, I've talked to Abraham, I'm talking to you, go to Vegas. So Seamus does it. And he hears a voice from God saying, okay, go into the Hard Rock Cafe and I want you to play one hand of poker. So Seamus goes in, sits down, and he gets dealt 7-2 off. Really rubbish hand, right? He's about to fold. He hears a voice from God saying, go all in. All in on 7-2 off. Like, no way, God, go all in. So, as I say, a religious man, he puts all his money in, and somebody's got a pair of queens, someone's got a king ace. But sure enough, when the flop comes, bam, bam, he gets a 2, the river a 7, and another 7, and he gets a full house and he wins. He's like, I don't believe it. Then he hears a voice from God saying, now take all that money and go to the roulette table and, go play blackjack. So he takes all the money, puts all his money in one hand of blackjack. He gets dealt 16. He's about to stick. God says, hit. So he hits, so he gets 2. He says 18. He's about to stick. God says, hit. He hits again, gets an ace, 19. He's about to stick. God says, hit again. Seamus like, you serious? God says, hit again. He hits again, 2, gets 21, wins a fortune. People are starting to clap. People are amazed. And then God says, okay, go to roulette, put it all on 7. He goes, puts it all on 7. This massive crowd by now is gathered there. The ball's rolling. Seamus is sweating. The ball lands on 7. And he starts crying. He shouts to heaven, I don't believe it. And then he hears God one last time saying, I don't believe it either. You're the luckiest motherfucker I've ever seen. I think it's the true essence of Christianity is that we think God knows. But the moment of the salvatory moment is when we realize that the absolute doesn't know either. That's when we're woven in.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Oh, I love that.
Of course, the gambling is a wonderful illustration, seems to me, of our relationship to unknowing. And it's not accidental that it comes back to the question of money, which I was saying a moment ago, that money is a huge tool, which, by the way, human beings didn't always have. I love this book by David Graeber called Debt.
Yeah, it's very
First
good.
5,000 years. Graeber is brilliant, anthropologist, economist, and he basically debunks the myth that basically human beings have always been related to possession and to money and as a prime kind of orienting value and so on. And he says, no, the human economy of Aboriginal and indigenous peoples is utterly different from the market economy of the contemporary world. But if money gives us the illusion of everything given its measure and everything knowable, everything calculatable, and everything can be booked. Gambling is the rebellion against this tyranny of money, where I open myself to chance. And I think it's not taking it too far to say what one really becomes addicted to when one becomes a gambling addict is this opening to chance. But of course, my other point I want to make is that this is a perversion of our most fundamental need for this opening, which isn't on a roulette table. Or a blackjack table. It is when we face the other person.
Wow.
And when we face life itself, we need to be open to what we don't anticipate, something that is a kind of miracle, a kind of chance opening to something we didn't know. And the key then is, how do we hold ourselves in that posture of pure expectancy, or even more than expectancy, anticipation of what we don't know may be there.
there's a great Twilight Zone episode called A Nice Place to Visit, and it's about a guy who he's doing a bank robbery, and he gets shot, and he wakes up, and there's a guy in a white suit standing over him, and he's like, "Oh, who are you?" And he takes a gun out and he holds it to the guy. The guy laughs, says, "You don't need a gun. You don't need a gun. I'm here to help you." And dusts him down. And he's like, "Where am I? You're just here." And he says, "I want your money." He goes, "Listen, you can have as much as you want. He said, "Come with me." Brings him to this big mansion. He says, "There's money in that drawer. Here, take as much as you want. In fact, you can have the mansion." And this guy's like, "Okay, this is weird." But he says, the guy says, "What else would you like?" He says, "You like to gamble, don't you?" He says, "You go and gamble, and every day if you want." And he says, "If you ever get bored, give me a call on that phone." So this guy starts to realize this is the afterlife, and he goes and he gambles, and he wins every time. He's always winning, can't lose. And eventually he's going a bit crazy, and he phones up this guy, and he comes back, and the guy says, "Listen, this is terrible." He says, I'm winning all the time." And so the guy goes, "Oh, what percentage of time would you like to lose?" He goes, No, that's not it." He says, "This is horrific." He says, I shouldn't even be in heaven anyway. I'm a terrible person." And of course, the guy laughs and says, "What made you think you were in heaven? This is hell, right?" And then, he laughs, and it goes out. It's a beautiful Twilight Zone from like 1969 or whatever. And the beautiful thing is this is the realm of pure positivity, right? There is no negation, right? This guy goes to what, and ironically, what we think of as heaven, which is pure positivity without negation, without lack. And it's not some place of wonder. It's not some place that is amazing. It's precisely a place that is hellish and terrifying. And so, as Richard's saying, that one of the things about gambling is precisely the gambler is addicted to, in a way, is addicted to loss, addicted to the spatiality of the lack itself. One thing we have in Northern Ireland, I had a friend from America over recently, and it's very funny when this happens, because in Ireland we have a very sophisticated gift economy that's not about money, and so you buy around for people. So whenever you go to a bar, everyone fights to buy around, right? And the whole idea is it's a gift, right? A gift which is a non-economic. You don't get anything in return, right? So and this creates friendship and meaning and respect. But if someone never buys around, eventually people start to notice, like you don't keep tabs of it, but every now and again someone buys it around. When I went to America and I bought rounds, Americans could never understand it, because it felt like it was an act of generosity, but then it was like no one ever did it back, and it was always very complicated. Well, my friend was just going, "Everyone's very generous in Ireland," and I had to sit him down after a couple of weeks and said to him, "Yeah, you're going to have to buy around, right? There's this, and you don't know it. So you're just thinking everyone's really generous, but it's a gift economy." But the issue is, it's not economy, because you're not taking note and you're not kind of buying a drink for each other. It's a gift, but it's at the same time, there is reciprocity going on over the course of a year. And if, by the way, you have more money, you'll buy more rounds, less money, you'll buy less. It's a very sophisticated grammar, but it's a grammar of kind of gift. And that's how friendships really solidify in Ireland.
I love that.
Graeber talked about it, because one of the things Graeber talks about is he gives a little parable where he basically says, I think it's an Australian parable, where in this village, everybody, gives and takes fish and food and provisions, but there's one person who is always taking and doesn't give. And eventually they kill him, they slit his throat, right? And I'm like, what does that mean? And it's like, oh yeah, it's easier to kill a person and explain these underlying things, I experienced that with this person. I was going like, I couldn't tell him. I was almost going to ruin my friendship because I couldn't actually say the issue. And it's like, then I remembered that little parable and went, well, I'm either going to slit his throat or I'm going to have to tell him. But it's so hard to describe, but we swim in the waters of gift. And of course, here's the idea, is that without gift, there's no meaning. Without sacrifice, there's no meaning. If economy is all about balancing the books, having the ledgers, like blockchain, all the ledgers are completely correct, right? There's no meaning. There's no value. Only when you sacrifice, when you give without return, is there meaning. And of course, gift is the realm of giving without return.
So, okay, let me ask this: Are there any practices that could sustain someone in this posture of unknowing, in this existential place of relating to the void, the lack that we've been talking about?
I have a comment about that. I hope it's not going to be too brief to sort of give the right picture, but and it's a negative answer to your question in the sense that I want to talk a bit about guilt.
Okay.
And guilt as a kind of closure of this openness toward unknowing. We often think, and Freud was centered so much on this question of the superego as a kind of taskmaster who's dominating the guilty person. So you're enslaved and abused by this terrible over voice that condemns you over and over again. In the aftermath of my son's death, I found myself desperately wanting to know, and then more and more being driven into the corner of feeling maybe this is all my fault. Guilt became enormously compelling. But then very gradually, it took years, and it took writing about it was really what I think liberated me from this guilt. But I began to realize at some point that my assuming that I was to blame, or that maybe I was to blame, and catching myself in those coils, in those tangles of what do I have to sort of own here as my responsibility, my sin, my guilt. I began to realize that was less of a question, actually, than an already accomplished interpretation, an accusation of myself as the key to the whole thing. I began to realize I was invested in assuming a guilty posture as a way of avoiding the openness to saying, I don't know what happened. And furthermore, beyond that, I have to face up the unknown, not only of Oliver's death, but of Oliver's life. I don't really know what I so loved about him. And only by being really open to that unknowing, the zone of what's actually joyous in him, that he would surprise me. And in death, my memories of him surprised me. I thought again, as though he kind of came back to me in everything that was charming about him and magnetic and lovable, were things I didn't ultimately know. And thereby, for me, giving up guilt was really crucial to recovering my sense of my relationship with my son. And beyond that, and this is what led to this religion book, giving up guilt was a way of reopening myself and realizing that guilt was actually a kind of means of closing.
Wow.
Myself. It was kind of like you shut yourself up in your own little cell of guiltiness, and you thereby relinquish the opening that's always right in front of us. It's just a question of whether we can truly open ourselves to that opening.
Wow.
Can I then say a little bit about how we might be able to do this on an institutional way? Because there's ways individually
Please.
we can do this, but what I call transformance art is this idea. So if you imagine in psychoanalysis, maybe a person goes to an analyst because they want to be fixed, right? They want to get over something. They want maybe to get somebody back, whatever it is. And they go to the analysis, and maybe at first they just see a person just like them. So the level of what's called the imaginary, they see a regular person, maybe with expertise, but it's just a regular person like them. Maybe we'll give them expert advice, counsel them, and help them. But analysis can't really kick off at that point. But then gradually over time, the person, without even realizing, might start to treat the analyst as a type of symbolic figure, like almost like, oh, you won't like it whenever I tell you this. But, right, in other words, maybe their father or their mother wouldn't like it if they said this. And so they're starting to treat the analyst as maybe in a symbolic way. And then there's the real, where eventually maybe the analyst becomes a stand-in for that thing, for the lack itself, and the person starts to even dream about the analyst. And that's why you sit on a couch and look there. Boothby, your book, whenever I think of you as a writer, I'll call you Boothby. And as a friend, Richard, so I just call you Boothby there. Richard's book, Sex on the Couch, I think you go into this. It's a wonderful book. But that the one of the reasons why maybe the analyst sits behind the person is precisely so you don't have this image of, and you're not seeing their face, you're not looking at the stuff on their wall and their books, and they kind of become a disembodied, not even voice, because they're not even saying anything. I did Lacanian analysis; those bastards say nothing, right? So you're kind of speaking into a void. So and then eventually, maybe over time, for a neurotic, you come to talk through the contradictions of your life and your symptoms. You grind your teeth because you want to shout at somebody, and you want to keep quiet because you don't want to break up with them, whatever. And eventually you get down to these fundamental contradictions, and the fundamental contradiction of your desire, the fundamental contradiction of who you are, and you kind of accept that fundamental contradiction, and maybe that, maybe we'll call that the cure, right? So in a similar way, I want to say someone might go to church because they think God's going to fix them, God, or the church has got some advice, right? They go to the congregation and they see maybe people just like them. But, eventually in the church, they all dress in crazy outfits and stuff. And it leads to a symbolic thing, the person at the front isn't just an individual. They're kind of a representative of God, of the absolute, right? In some way, you don't even think about it, but that's what the liturgy is. And then maybe the liturgy can become an embodiment of the real. So the Transformance art, the idea is that whenever I did icon, people would come into that gathering, maybe thinking we had the answer or something like that. And very gradually, through art and music, spoken word, comedy, the liturgy itself would not give an answer, but would be self-divided, would show that unknowing is within itself. So the art, the music, the speaking, the storytelling, the comedy would not answer the person's lack, but would in a way reflect back that lack, but seen from the liturgical place. And so one very quick example is we did a thing called Sins of the Father, a midnight gathering, and you went into the bar, and all around the bar were hundreds of broken wine glasses, and the DJ was playing, and I think there was a parable being said over the music, which was, at the end of days, all of humanity stand before the judgment seat, and the book of life is opened, and the people look to see if God's name is written. And they, in one voice, say, when we were naked, did you clothe us? When we were hungry, did you feed us? When we were in prison, did you visit us? And basically a parable about condemning God, And that night we got people to write down times when they felt God had sinned against them. Now, a lot of people didn't believe in God, but they knew what it was. When the times when they felt the world, the universe, reality, God had let them down. Write them on pieces of paper. And if they didn't want them read, they X'd them. And then we began to read these. It was like, I was honest, and, I was robbed. The person I love, the woman I love, is with someone else. I'm estranged from my family. All of these incredibly, profoundly painful things. And we put them into this fire to send the aroma up to God. And then we took the ash, and everybody got some of the ash to take home. But the idea of doing something like that, and we poured red wine into the wine glasses as we read these. So the hundreds of broken wine glasses just poured red wine, and the wine dripped onto the tables and onto the floor. So at the end of the night, we just had hundreds of these red wine bottles, these broken bottles. We had the ash.
Wow.
A couple of things that were important for us. One is that it sensitized us to the dimension of the suffering of the other, because you heard all of these other things that people were wrestling with. It really sensitized you to the battles that other people are fighting, which I think is very important in the liturgy. But also at the very end, the bit that I didn't talk about is there was poetry and there was music that kind of was accusations to God, but also this sense of kind of like the brokenness of God in all of this. Now, the idea is doing one of those services doesn't do anything, but if you're on a monthly basis having events like that, I think that can be curative, like that can have a really positive experience, not only in sensitizing you to the other, but also to realizing, to basically experiencing the liturgical structure that that overlaps your lack with its lack. And that, yeah, so there, and that for me is the core move of kind of a power of theological liturgy.
Okay. Wow, that's so good. Okay, guys, I know we've talked quite a bit, and man, I could sit here and listen to you guys talk for hours. Is there anything else that you feel like I've missed, either asking you about your book or Pete, your project? Like, is there anything else around either Unknowing or radical directions in Christianity that would be helpful to explore?
I'll finish with a comment and leave the floor to Rick to finish
Okay.
up. Lacan, famously did a seminar on what's called the four discourses, and these are like four different kind of ways of interacting. And what one's called the master's discourse. Then there's the university's discourse. There's what's called the analyst discourse and the hysterics discourse. And in a very brief nutshell, is like, the master's discourse is a discourse in which you can imagine like a child being told, don't put your hand on the stove, or don't, no, the discourse of no, not really an explanation, but it's a demand. And the university discourse is the discourse of the professional who's got lots of advice about what you should and shouldn't do, why you shouldn't put your hand on the fire, whatever. And then, the analyst discourse is this kind of discourse in which you're not told what to do, you're not given professional advice, but through the other, you confront your own desire, you confront your own disavowed desires. Somehow the other kind of takes up that space, like the analyst. This is why it's called the analyst discourse. They take up a space in which you come to start seeing your own contradictions through the analyst. And then there's the hysterics discourse. The hysterics discourse is you're spoken to by a divided subject. Now, the reason why I say all this is I imagine within Christianity, we've got churches of the master's discourse, churches which tell you divine command theory. They'll tell you what to do, and you just do what you're told, right? And natural law or whatever. You also have progressive churches of the university discourse, churches which will give you lots of advice about how to live well, how to have a good marriage, who to vote for, right? They give you lots of seeming advice and lots of like ethical sermons. That interestingly, the what you see in Jesus, I think, is more of an analyst discourse. That in this figure of Jesus, you don't really get like what you should and shouldn't do. And there's not much advice because all of the parables are so complicated to unpick and can mean various things. But it seems like this figure helped people see their own disavowed truth. Through parables, you saw parts of yourself that you didn't want to see, right? So you came to some sight. So there's this beautiful verse that says, you shall know the truth and the truth shall set you free. Now, that's not mathematical truth. Is you shall know the truth, as in you will encounter the truth of your own, disavowed self. But weirdly, the very confrontation with that is itself free. So there's something in the figure of Jesus that is I think, an analyst discourse. But for me, what I really want to do is have a church of the hysterical church. So in a sense, we're all hysterics, which means we're all self-divided. The hysteric is the person who kind of goes, should I be doing this job? Does that person really love me? Do I really like what I'm doing? Right? They're a question but a suffering question, right? The psychotic individual might be very detached from the world. The perverse subject is very in the world, but the neurotic subject is in the world, but not of it, right? They're in the world, but they feel that they're kind of, they don't fit with it. And in one sense, the answer is to become enjoyably in the world, but not of it, to enjoy the fact you don't fit in. So instead of like types of therapy that try to integrate you into the world more, actually, no, you don't want to be integrated. You want to kind of enjoy the fact that all of us are excessive to the world, like the Sartrean idea that none of us we're all more and less than and different than our roles. So what does it mean to have an hysterical God? And that for me is the figure of Christ, which is my God, why have you forsaken me? Which is that you have a liturgical institution in which the liturgy embodies a self-divided absolute. And as you symbolically identify with that absolute through the music and the art and the comedy, you come to terms with your own neurosis, your own dividedness. And as you come to terms with your own dividedness, a different form of collective arises. So if a community is a group of people who gather together around shared beliefs and shared practices, a communion is a group who circle around a lack, right? So the death of God, a communion is a meal around the death of God and the lack of God, right? So in a way, if you can have a collective in which the people in it have come to terms with their own dividedness, the dividedness of the others in the room and the dividedness of reality itself, then this moves us from community to communion. And I think it creates a healthy form of I think it just provides a healthy group. Put it like that.
Yeah. Wow. What do you think, Rick? Or is there something kind of that you would want to end on to kind of tie things up together for yourself?
Well, I think the best thing to say in answer to that, response to that, is that in writing this book, I went through a kind of a personal reevaluation of the religious. I must say, I've spent my life a bit back and forth about my posture, my sense of relationship to the religious. And when my son died, I was, and since I've moved from a pretty atheistic position, the sort of thing you'd expect from a lot of philosophy professors like me. But I must say, in writing this book, which puts the sense of the sacred, the experience, the opening up toward the sacred, in relationship to unknowing, to something. The original title that the editor unfortunately didn't like very well was "Is Nothing Sacred?" Peter and I were both disappointed that the editor sort of put the kibosh on this title.
I think they were very wrong. They were very wrong.
Because the answer, of course, the preface is still called "Is Nothing Sacred?" And I make the point, yes, the answer is yes. The sacred is precisely resides in the nothing, in the sort of to the nothing, in a void. And this thesis has allowed me to sort of look at world religions and their history and their structure and meaning and so on in a new, much more sympathetic way, I have to say. One of the things I love about the book, and which makes me think I'll almost certainly have to write at least one other one that
yes, please do,
reopens these questions. But I personally feel really happy that I have a new sense of respect for the religious and deep sympathy for it, and I basically go so far as to say in the book that the religious impulse is the human symptom par excellence. It's not what Freud said. The religious is not a childhood hangover that we have to finally grow out of and relinquish when we come into our intellectual maturity. No, I don't think that anymore. I think that the religious is much more fundamental to our essential nature, as open to what we don't know, above all in love, but in the appreciation of beauty, and in also the sense of doing our best, doing our duty. This we live with, and we need to live with this opening to what we don't know. Of course, at the same time, we defend ourselves against the unknown almost inevitably. Our everyday life is an enormous effort, very elaborated and detailed, to give us the sense that we do know. And thereby, religion is both an opening toward the unknown and a defense against it. It's both. That's the symptomatic character of it.
And then both of those never go away. They endure, forever. That you can't have one without the other.
Well, whether or not we can ever wholly get rid of that symptomatic defense, that reaction which tries to pre-gird ourselves beforehand in the face of the unknown, whether we can do better with that, whether we can, it seems to me this is one of the big questions I pose at the very end of the book. Can we engage and practice a richer, more vulnerable opening toward the unknown and the mysterious than religions have succeeded in keeping so far? I think that's the big challenge for the future. But I'm optimistic that it's possible, and I'm happy to have, even just for myself, to articulate a view of the religious that leaves that says, yes, there's really something valuable here, but also there's something to be worried about and to take very seriously and critically.
I think the innovation of, like, Richard's work is that, so within religion, there's always been an interest in the unknown and the unknowing, absolutely. And there's been some very sophisticated work on that, very rich work on that. What I think makes this work particularly significant is that what it adds to it is a sense, not simply there is a substantive thing that we do not know, but that the unknowing is within the unknown. The unknowing is kind of redoubled. That, for me, is a significant innovation. And I think it's also potentially that's where the seeds of overcoming this negative symptomology exists, because I think when you have the distance between the unknown and yourself, and there's that kind of distance, and religion protects and keeps open that, if you redouble the unknowing, so it's like, it's not just I'm castrated, God's castrated as well. So, traditionally you have the idea that we're all castrated except for God. Right, we're all castrated. We all have lack, except for one. One exception is God, right, the primal Father. And then you move into contemporary society where no one's castrated. Effectively, if you're castrated, it's only a contingent thing. You can be everything you want to be. You can have what you need to have through psychedelic enlightenment, commodity satisfaction, psychedelics, whatever it is. You can get rid of castration. The answer for me is to realize we're all castrated, including the absolute. And that's where my hope is for a liturgy that is based on the ideas of people like Richard and people like Zizek, people like McGowan. What they're showing, what they're offering is, and none of you guys are interested, I don't think, in kind of developing a liturgy, right, an ecclesiology. But actually, I do think there's an ecclesiology that can be excavated from your work that can offer an answer to this problematic of religion.
Wow. And we'll have to continue to explore that if you're open to that, because I've kind of rejected Christianity in a lot of ways, but in rereading the book and accessing your work, Pete, I'm interested in exploring what a radical kind of Lacanian Christianity could look like. So just thank you for kind of reigniting that flame in me, because it had kind of died.
Yeah, well, great. Because I honestly, people like yourself, because I know you have, you were a minister for a while, isn't that right?
Yes, I was.
Yeah. Is that my interest is in people who are actually currently doing that kind of work, who read people like Richard and McGowan and Zizek and go, oh, I can do something with these ideas from the pulpit. Because the idea is not that you teach it. It's not by teaching it. It's about, what would it look like if our hymns were like the Psalms, where God is unknowing, where God is, what would it look like to have, that's a very basic example, but Pádraig Ó Tuama has this beautiful album called Hymns to Swear By, and and it's got swearing, it's Hymns to Swear By. He's a wonderful poet from Ireland, and I think, Richard, his work, but Hymns to Swear By, it's a very hard to get, so you'll have to, but I'm sure you can find it online, and there's a beautiful song, and it's based on Jeremiah, and it goes, It says, you are my strength, but I am weak. You're my strength, but I am weak. You're my strength, but I am weak. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. So, I've given up sometimes when I've been tired. I've given up sometimes when I've been tired. Doesn't move you, doesn't move you. And then the final line is, I fucked it up so many times. I fucked it up so many times. I fucked it up so many times. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah.
Now I could
It's
sing
so good.
that.
One time I had a friend of mine, Vince Anderson. He's a wonderful guy, the Reverend Vince Anderson. He does a thing called Dirty Gospel. At 1 o'clock every week in Brooklyn, you'll find him at this bar, packed to the gills, doing what he calls Dirty Gospel, which is this gospel infused, kind of earthy, gritty. And he'll get naked and he'll be sweating and hanging from the balcony. There's a documentary about him, just came out actually. But he sang this one time. I was at a conference, and at the end of this religious conference, I got him to play that song. And at the end, you couldn't hear a pin drop. And then after about 30 seconds, which felt a lot longer, after about 30 seconds, the guy got up to kind of say to everybody, you can go to lunch. And he got up and he's about to speak, and somebody stood up and said, sit down. The guy got, sit down. He says, can you not hear what is happening? And in other words, can you not hear the silence? And then so he sat back down, and then you just heard about half a dozen people literally crying. You heard people cry. And just the power of, in a liturgical way,
Wow.
of that brokenness and that openness in a hymn was profound enough to make a whole room feel sacred for a moment. And so I go, like, I want people who are ministers who are listening to this podcast to go, right, I'm going to sing that in my church.
Yeah, no, that's great. Okay, so if we're ever in the same space in the future, the first round is on me. So we'll enter this gift economy.
We'll help you
yeah.
do it.
No, please
Not too
do.
bad.
I'm happy to.
My friend is so generous. He's such a generous guy. So like, it's not about you not being generous, but it's like, he was just going, I just thought everyone was like, we just buy me drinks. So yeah, very good. Thank you so much. I've had a blast.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Rick, thank you for your time. I'm glad it finally worked out with all the scheduling issues. So yeah, maybe at some point we can do another conversation, but this has been really great.
Right.
What is it that you say at the end?
I was going to say, yeah, would you mind the two of you just ending by saying continue the conversation?
Oh, yes. Well, I said first.
Yeah, why don't you say it first?
Here. Also, give me 1 second.
Sure.
I have a beautiful little benediction that Padraig wrote that I used to finish. We used to finish a lot of icons with.
Oh, perfect.
And it also, I think, fits with this. I can kind of remember it, but I'm just looking it up to be sure. So this is beautiful. Because Catholic Church ends with the benediction, and it's go in peace, right? So you go in peace. So Padraig wrote this for us. The task is ended. Go in pieces. Our faith has been rear-ended, certainty amended, and something might be mended that we didn't know was torn. And we are fire, bright burning fire, turning from the higher places into the hell in which we'll find our mothers, brothers, sisters, fathers, friends. Dear friends, the task is ended. Go in pieces to see and feel your world.
Wow.
So keep the conversation. What's it? Keep the conversation?
Or continue the conversation.
Continue the conversation. There you go.
Thank you.
I can make a really quick little addendum to that.
Yes.
Keep the conversation open. Peter was talking about Lacan's theory of the discourses. I think it's lovely to remember that the word discourse is a kind of play on course, your path. And if you're in a genuine discourse, maybe it's appropriate that the first three letters are a kind of negation of the course. Yeah. Discourse means your interaction with other people that makes you stop and hesitate about the course you've been on, and said maybe there's another course that's possible. And maybe, as Peter was saying a minute ago, maybe it's not only we human beings, we finite beings, who need to be open to a path we've never dreamt of before. Maybe the divine, maybe the Godhead itself is open in this way to a discourse, a going off course, which turns out to be the right path.
Wow. That's amazing. Yes. Thank you for that, Rick. Okay, guys, until next time.
Until next time, bye-bye.
Indeed. Keep the conversation.
Absolutely.